What if the biggest band you never fully knew about had 29 Billboard hits, but never owned their own name? The songs you heard everywhere were played by musicians the band had never met. Their guitarist was the man who'd become famous playing a fictionalized version of himself on a beloved TV comedy. And a decade after their last hit, they drew 600,000 people to the National Mall. This is the rise and fall of the Grassroots. It was 1965, and the American music scene was transforming almost overnight. The British invasion had shaken everything loose, and now a new sound was taking hold. Folk rock, driven by bands like the Byrds and the Mamas and the Papas. It was acoustic, it was emotionally resonant, and it was selling millions of records. Lou Adler, the sharp and savvy producer, saw the wave coming and decided to build the perfect vessel to ride it. Adler didn't recruit a band from a garage. He did something far more calculated. He tasked his go-to songwriting team, P.F. Sloan and Steve Barry, with creating a collection of songs tailor-made for the folk rock moment. Working under the pseudonym The Grassroots, Sloan and Barry recorded a demo track called Where Were You When I Needed You? Sloan sang the lead himself, backed by top Los Angeles session players, part of the loose collective that would later be known as the Wrecking Crew. The demo hit California radio and immediately caught fire. Disc jockeys played it. Listeners loved it. There was just one problem. There was no band. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. The name The Grassroots was itself a deliberate construction. It evoked authenticity, working-class identity, and a kind of bottom-up American spirit. Some insiders noted it also carried a winking double meaning, nodding to the growing drug culture of the youth counterculture. But the central irony was impossible to miss. A name that suggested organic, grassroots creation was in fact the product of a top-down corporate decision. Adler needed bodies, real musicians who could perform on television, play concerts, and give the brand a human face. He found them in a San Francisco group called the Bedouins. The Bedouins re-recorded Where Were You When I Needed You with their own vocalist, Bill Willie Fulton, replacing Sloan, cutting a new vocal over the original backing track. That version climbed to number 28 on the Billboard Hot 100 in mid-1966. The experiment worked, but the experiment didn't come with a partnership agreement. The Bedouins wanted creative freedom. They wanted to record their own songs. The label had no interest in that arrangement. When the band pushed back, the executives made a swift and decisive move. They moved on without the musicians and kept the name. Then they did something even more calculating. They locked in the rights to The Grassroots for themselves. The brand now existed independently of the musicians. The musicians were interchangeable. The brand was not. After the departure of the Bedouins, Dunhill went searching again. This time, they found their answer in a Los Angeles outfit called the 13th Floor. And the story of how this group became the Grassroots was as unlikely as anything in the music business. Warren Entner and Creed Bratton had met while busking on the streets of Israel in 1965. Two Americans wandering the world with guitars, forging a musical friendship thousands of miles from home. They returned to Los Angeles, formed the 13th Floor, and began playing clubs along the Sunset Strip. When their manager submitted a demo to the record company, the label offered them a choice: record under their own name or step into the shoes of the Grassroots, a name that already carried national radio recognition and a fan base they hadn't had to build themselves. They chose the name, and with that choice, the next chapter of this story began. There was still a missing piece. The group's original bass player had been drafted into the Army, and they needed a replacement fast. They recruited a Hollywood musician named Rob Grill, a guitarist by trade who learned bass specifically to join the group. Grill had been working at American Recording in Hollywood, alongside two relative unknowns at the time, Corey Wells and John Kay, who would become key frontmen in Three Dog Night and Steppenwolf. Rob Grill's arrival transformed the band's identity. His voice was bluesy, warm, and soulful, a voice that cut through the polished production of the era with something that felt like genuine emotion. And it was that voice combined with the manufacturing machinery that was about to be played on radios from coast to coast. In the spring of 1967, as the summer of love was just beginning to bloom, the Grassroots released Let's Live for Today. The song had originally been written by an Italian-based British band called The Rogues, recorded in Italian. Steve Barri adapted it for American ears, sharpened the arrangement, and gave it the urgent psychedelic pop feeling that defined 1967. With its distinctive intro and psychedelic, sitar-like guitar phrasing, it sounded like the moment itself captured on magnetic tape. The timing was extraordinary. Young American men were facing the draft. The Vietnam War was escalating week by week. The future felt uncertain and dangerous. Let's Live for Today wasn't just a pop song. For a generation staring down the barrel of uncertainty, the idea of living only in that moment carried the full weight of lived experience. The song climbed to number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100, sold over 2 million copies, and earned the group their first gold disc. Even then, the machinery behind the music remained largely invisible. On the finished single, much of the backing track came from the wrecking crew, rather than the touring band. The band performed on national television, but nobody in the viewing audience knew the record had been built largely by people who weren't on the stage. And for a while, that didn't matter. The music was real, the feeling was real, the hit was absolutely real. By 1968, the hit machine was running at full speed. Midnight Confessions became the group's highest charting single, climbing all the way to number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100. The story behind that song was a perfect illustration of how the grassroots world actually worked. Midnight Confessions was originally written by Lou Josie for his managed group, the Evergreen Blues Band. Steve Barri heard the demo, recognized its commercial potential immediately, and claimed it for the grassroots. The song was then handed to top Los Angeles session musicians, who handled the instrumentation, built around one of the most recognizable bass lines in late 60s pop. Rob Grill and Warren Entner shared the lead vocals, their voices trading back and forth with a natural, intimate warmth that sounded nothing like the corporate calculation behind it. On television, the band performed the song with confidence and charm. On radio, it was inescapable. What listeners didn't know, and what the label had no interest in broadcasting, was that the men on screen had not played a single note on the studio recording. Creed Bratton would later say it sometimes felt like they were a fake band, performing songs they hadn't actually cut in the studio. He had profound respect for the Wrecking Crew's technical genius, but something essential felt missing. He was performing music he hadn't made, under a name he didn't own, for a label that could replace him tomorrow. Between 1967 and 1972, the Grassroots were reportedly on the Billboard charts for 307 consecutive weeks. That record placed them among the most reliable hit-making entities in the entire history of American pop music. The hits came with stunning consistency. I'd Wait a Million Years reached number 15 in 1969. Temptation Eyes matched that peak in 1971. Sooner or Later climbed to number 9, their strongest showing since Midnight Confessions. Two Divided by Love added another top 20 entry to a streak that seemed like it would never end. They notched more than 20 entries on the Hot 100 and are often credited with 29 charting singles across the various Billboard charts. These were the songs playing at graduation parties and drive-in movies and summer road trips. They were the songs on the radio when young men drove away from home for the first time, or came back from Vietnam trying to remember what normal felt like. The Grassroots were everywhere, and the men actually making the music, more often than not, were somewhere else entirely. By the time 1969 arrived, the cracks were beginning to show. The band that had conquered AM radio was quietly fracturing from within, and the incident that signaled the end of the classic lineup came at one of the most storied venues in rock history, the Fillmore West in San Francisco. 1969, Creed Bratton, the guitarist who had once busked on the streets of Israel and dreamed of making something real, later described walking onto that stage while high on LSD. As the drug took hold, he found himself unable to play his guitar, reportedly pretending to play an invisible accordion instead, watching his own hands begin to glow in ways only he could see. The performance was a disaster by any measure. Shortly after the Fillmore incident, Bratton was asked to leave. His departure felt, in retrospect, like the end of something essential. He transitioned into acting, a profession he described wryly as having a casualty rate even higher than the music business. Decades later, millions came to know him through an entirely different kind of performance, playing a fictionalized version of himself on the NBC comedy The Office, where his history with the Grassroots became a recurring punchline and, eventually, a genuine source of pride. But Bratton's exit was more than a personnel change. It was the moment when the band's underlying instability became undeniable. What followed was a long stretch of lineup changes through the early 1970s. The carousel spun so fast that even dedicated fans struggled to keep track. But here was the darkest irony. The audience barely noticed. To the average listener, the Grassroots wasn't a specific group of individuals. It was a sound, it's a feeling, a brand. The system had been designed from the beginning to work exactly this way. The musicians were the replaceable parts, the name was the asset, and the asset kept producing returns long after the original human beings who gave it meaning had moved on. By the early 1970s, the musical landscape that had made the Grassroots unstoppable was shifting beneath their feet. The era of the hook-heavy, 3-minute AM radio pop song was giving way to something harder, longer, and more demanding. Progressive rock was pushing compositions past the 10-minute mark. Arena rock was built around spectacle and guitar virtuosity. Disco was beginning its slow conquest of the dance floor and the cultural conversation. The carefully crafted, wrecking crew polished pop formula that had defined the Grassroots was starting to feel like yesterday's architecture. The hits grew harder to come by. The momentum that had carried them through 307 consecutive weeks on the charts began to slow, then stall, then stop. In 1972, the band released the compilation A Lotta Mileage, a title that felt almost self-aware, as if the band itself recognized it was running on accumulated reputation rather than fresh momentum. The album failed to produce a meaningful hit. The streak that had defined them was over. By 1974, the group had left their record label and attempted a fresh start. But without the full production machinery of Adler and Barry, without the wrecking crew in the studio, and without the promotional muscle of a major label behind them, the group struggled to find new footing. Their last Hot 100 single of the classic era, Mamacita, reached number 71 in 1975. Then the chart appearances stopped altogether. The Grassroots hadn't imploded in a dramatic blaze of ego and excess. There were no tabloid headlines, no police reports, no screaming matches in the studio. They had simply been ground down by the system they were embedded in from the very beginning. The hits stopped. The label moved on. The musicians were left holding a name they didn't legally own. It was a quiet erosion. Rob Grill had been the common thread running through all of it. He had been there since 1967, through the gold records, the television appearances, the lineup changes, and the slow commercial decline. When the group finally stepped back from active pursuit of the charts in 1975, Grill didn't disappear. He stayed close to the music, worked on the organizational side of the industry, and kept his faith in the songs. In 1979, encouraged by friends in Fleetwood Mac, he released a solo album titled Uprooted. It was a quiet, personal record, far removed from the shimmer and shine of the hit years. But something far more significant was happening behind the scenes. Grill moved to secure legal control of the Grassroots name from the old corporate structure. The specifics of the transaction were never widely publicized, but the outcome was genuinely transformative. The name that had been created in a boardroom to serve a corporate strategy. The name that had been used to cycle out musicians like machine components. The name that had generated millions of dollars for everyone except the people performing under it. That name now belonged to Rob Grill. By the early 1980s, he relaunched the group under banners like The Grassroots starring Rob Grill, a modest declaration, but a real one. For the first time in the band's entire history, a musician was in control. And then came the moment that proved something the music industry rarely acknowledged. The songs had always been bigger than the business arrangements surrounding them. On July 4th, 1982, the Grassroots performed on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The crowd that gathered was enormous, all with estimates often reported around 600,000 people. Nearly a decade had passed since their last major hit. The corporate infrastructure was long gone, but the people came anyway, because the music had never left them. Rob Grill continued to tour until his final years, performing heavily, often playing dozens of shows annually, keeping the music alive for audiences who remembered, and for new listeners discovering it for the first time. He lived for years in chronic pain from a degenerative bone disorder. Yet, he kept climbing onto stages and singing those songs. He passed away on July 11, 2011. Control of the Grassroots name remained with his estate, ensuring that the musicians he personally chose could continue honoring a tradition that stretched back more than 4 decades. The songs themselves outlasted every corporate structure, every legal battle, every lineup change, every personnel carousel. Let's Live for Today and Midnight Confessions remained genuine classics, instantly recognizable, emotionally honest, built on arrangements that managed to be both precisely manufactured and somehow completely sincere. The Grassroots never wrote their biggest songs. They never played on most of their biggest records. For the first 2 decades of their existence, they never legally owned their own name. By every conventional measure of artistic sovereignty, they were a manufactured product from start to finish. And yet, when 600,000 Americans gathered on the National Mall on the 4th of July and listened to those songs drift across the summer air, nobody was thinking about who owned the publishing rights. They were thinking about who they were when they first heard that music. They were thinking about the people they loved and the places they'd been. They were feeling something true. The Grassroots didn't own the machine, but they owned the memories. And in the end, that's the only currency that lasts. The Grassroots proved you don't have to own the machine to own the moment. They never controlled the studio, the contracts, or even their own name. But they gave a generation something no corporation could manufacture: genuine feeling. The songs remain because they were real, even when the system behind them wasn't. What Grassroots song takes you back? Leave a comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from rock's greatest era.